Okay, so ever get those moments where, you get like a sneak peek backstage, and suddenly what's happening behind the curtain is like way more interesting than the main show?
Yeah, totally.
Well, that's kind of what we're doing today. We're taking a deep dive into the inner workings of the New York Times, but not the news stories, not the stuff we usually see.
Right.
We're talking about what it's like to actually work there, all thanks to, get this, a former employee who did not hold back.
Yeah, it's really interesting how much weight a firsthand account can actually have, especially in a case like this. We're talking about a pretty scathing Glassdoor review, someone who actually worked at the New York Times, and it gets into some pretty serious accusations.
Yeah, and this isn't just like someone complaining about a bad day at the office or something. This is alleging like hypocrisy, toxic work environment,
Yeah.
a real disconnect between, the image that the New York Times likes to project that they put out there and what this employee actually experienced.
Right.
So our mission today is to really unpack this whole thing. We're going to dig into the specifics of what's in this review, think about what it means in the bigger picture, and hopefully leave you with, maybe some questions to ponder about the whole thing. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's key, right? Trying to understand the context of all of this and what are the potential consequences of what we're about to read,
Certainly.
especially when it's coming from someone who's claiming to have, insider knowledge
Exactly.
of what's really going on.
And the thing that really jumped out at me at the very beginning was this accusation that the Times does not practice what they preach, which is kind of a loaded statement when you think about it. We're talking about an organization that's known for investigative journalism, for holding others accountable.
Right.
And now they're being accused of similar, like, questionable behavior.
Exactly. It's interesting, right? It really speaks to the potential, dissonance between the public face that an institution might have
Oh, yeah.
and then the internal reality.
Well,
And especially with the New York Times, an organization that wields so much power in terms of shaping the narrative,
for sure.
that power has to come with accountability, right?
Absolutely.
So when you have an organization like that that's then accused of this hypocrisy, it can really damage public trust.
And it makes you wonder, like, what impact does that have on the media as a whole?
Oh, absolutely. And it feeds into, a much broader distrust of institutions that we see across really all sectors.
Right.
People are really looking for authenticity.
Yeah.
And so when you see organizations that are known for holding others to this kind of higher standard and then they fall short, it can be incredibly disillusioning.
It's very easy to be disillusioned these days.
Yeah.
And this reviewer actually gives an example, a very specific one. They say that the Times reports on inequalities at other companies for their terrible labor practices without reflecting on their own.
Right.
Basically saying, hey, you're calling out other people for the same stuff that you're doing internally.
Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
a powerful accusation to make. And it kind of leads us to, I think, this next layer of the review, which is this: the allegation of a toxic work environment. So it's not just this disconnect between, words and actions, but actually like the day-to-day.
What it feels like to be there.
Exactly. And the reviewer paints a picture of a culture that, frankly, sounds very dysfunctional.
Totally. And this is where those details get really interesting. They go on to outline some pretty serious issues.
Yeah.
They claim things like retaliatory HR practices, a lack of accountability from leadership. They even describe like a push-out culture, where speaking up is basically, it's penalized.
Right.
It seems like the only people that thrive there are the ones who either just go along with everything or stay silent.
Yeah.
Have you seen that at other organizations at all?
Oh, absolutely. Sadly, these patterns, they're not unique to the New York Times, A push-out culture, it's like this, it's a subtle form of toxicity. It's not always like, in-your-face bullying or harassment.
Right.
It's more like, it's more the system where people who disagree, they're stifled, they're marginalized, or they're kind of like slowly forced out.
Yeah.
Which can be even more damaging in fields like journalism, where you need those different perspectives, that
I bet.
willingness to challenge the way things are.
It's almost insidious in a way.
Yeah.
Like a slow poison, versus a sudden shock or something.
Right.
And I think what struck me is how this culture seems to completely contradict what the New York Times says it stands for publicly. Like, they always talk about diversity inclusion.
Right, exactly. And that's really the heart of it, isn't it? That gap between, the values you put on a poster
Yeah.
and what your employees are actually experiencing day to day. And, it's one thing to have these programs and these statements about inclusion.
Totally.
But if you want to actually have a workplace where everyone feels like they belong,
Yeah.
it takes a much deeper change.
For sure. It's got to be more than just like surface level stuff.
Exactly, exactly.
And this reviewer really, they hit on this point with a couple of stories. And they're kind of shocking to read, honestly.
Yeah.
In one of them, they talk about how their boss, who was white, refused to go to a restaurant because he said it was too ghetto.
Wow.
And then at another time, they were actually told to take images out of a presentation because the people in the pictures, they said, looked too urban.
Just how
It's very telling.
it is. Makes you wonder, like, how deep do these problems actually go? Especially given what the Times says about these very issues, publicly.
Yeah, and those stories, if they're true, they show a real gap between words and actions. It highlights how important it is to actually listen to what your employees are going through,
Oh, yeah.
especially people from marginalized groups.
Yeah.
Because what they experience every
Like
day,
their own culture.
that's the truth of your workplace.
Exactly. And then you have to ask, like, how does a company, especially one like the New York Times, how do they respond to this kind of stuff when it comes out? And, well, this reviewer is very, very critical of how they handled it, or how they didn't handle it, I guess I should say. Yeah, yeah. And, their reaction really gets at this core issue of transparency, accountability, which in a world where information spreads so fast, companies can't just ignore this stuff.
Right.
When serious issues like this are raised, especially about your own workplace, people need to see a real effort to listen and to do something about it.
Absolutely. And they felt like the apologies were totally empty.
Yeah.
And that during those Q&A sessions, it was all about damage control.
Right.
Like protecting themselves.
Right.
Instead of actually trying to fix anything.
Yeah.
And, this is the reviewer's words. They think that maybe the New York Times was more worried about their image as a company, especially as a publicly traded company, than about the people who work there.
Yeah, and that's something to really think about. When a company is just focused on the bottom line, on making money,
Right.
it often comes at a cost.
Exactly.
And usually the people who pay are the employees.
Totally.
And the values that the company claims to have. But it's not unique to the New York Times,
Right.
This is something we see across all kinds of industries.
It's a systemic thing. And this whole, idea that profit comes first.
Yay.
It made me think about something else this reviewer said, which was that a lot of talented people, they see the Times as a resume builder.
Yeah.
Like it's just a stepping stone to get somewhere better.
Right.
So they're not planning on staying there very long.
And that high turnover, especially when it's because people are unhappy or they feel like they're not valued,
Right.
that's a big warning sign.
For sure.
It tells you that maybe that company isn't really invested in its employees.
It makes you wonder about the long-term impact. If a place gets this kind of reputation,
Right.
will they even be able to attract good people in the future?
That's the question.
Yeah.
Because the best people, they have choices.
Oh, yeah. They can go anywhere they want.
And they are looking for places that share their values.
Right, where they feel supported.
Exactly, where they feel appreciated.
It makes you wonder how often this happens, like where there's this big difference between how a company wants to be seen and what it's really like to work there.
Yeah, and the problem is that we usually only hear about it through things like this, right?
Right.
Anonymous reviews, which are easy to dismiss. People say, oh, it's just one person. It's just one experience.
Right. They're just complaining.
Exactly. But then when you actually look closer, you see a pattern.
Yeah.
It's not just one person. It's a bigger issue.
Totally. And it brings up a big question about accountability, like especially for a place like the New York Times that's supposed to hold other powerful people accountable.
Exactly. It's like, who watches the Watchmen, right?
Exactly.
And it makes you realize that we all have a responsibility to be a little skeptical, even with sources that we think are trustworthy.
Right.
We can't just take everything at face value. We have to look deeper, look for different perspectives, be willing to ask those tough questions.
Oh, for sure. And this reviewer, they end their post with this plea to the New York Times management.
Yeah.
Basically asking them to just acknowledge what's going on and, actually do something to make it better.
Yeah.
But you can kind of tell they're not very hopeful.
Yeah.
Like they don't actually think it'll change anything. It's kind of sad, actually.
It is, but it also shows why these conversations are so important.
Right.
The more we talk about these things, the more aware people become.
Right.
And that's how things actually start to change. By putting a spotlight on the problem, someone once said that sunlight is the best disinfectant.
That's a good one.
It is. It's very true. So yeah, by shining a light on these issues, we're making it harder for them to stay hidden.
Yeah, I love that. And this whole deep dive, it started with just this one anonymous review on Glassdoor.
Right.
But look where we ended up. We're talking about everything from toxic workplaces to the responsibilities of powerful institutions.
Yeah.
Like how we even decide what to believe these days.
And sometimes that's all it takes. One little thing to get people thinking,
Totally.
like a spark that starts a bigger fire.
Yeah, I love that.
So it just goes to show every voice matters, every story matters.
Absolutely.
You never know when something you say, something you do could have a much bigger impact.
So true. Well, for anyone listening who wants to see this review for themselves, we'll link it in the show notes. But more importantly, don't let this be the end of the conversation. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and who knows, maybe you'll spark a deep dive of your own.